His nickname was Bull, and enemies trembled when they heard his name. William Frederick Halsey Jr. hid behind the mask of a fearless admiral decisions that cost thousands of lives and forever divided opinions about his legacy. He threw his fleet into battle where others would have retreated. He did not fear storms and pushed through tempests that swallowed ships like toys. He was praised for courage and at the same time condemned for risk bordering on recklessness. Some saw him as a hero, while others believed he was a danger to his own men. Why did the name William Halsey become a symbol of victory and at the same time a synonym of controversy among military historians? What secret lies behind his fame, and what decisions shaped not only battles, but the destiny of an entire generation of sailors? The answers await you ahead, and they make this story one of the most gripping. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. William Frederick Halsey Jr. was born in Elizabeth, New Jersey, on October 30th, 1882. His father, Captain William Halsey Sr., had served in the Navy with distinction, and the call of the sea reached the boy from his earliest years. The elder Halsey embodied strict discipline, yet young William carried a restless energy that never fully matched military convention. At the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Halsey was not the best student, but he was remembered for his charisma and ability to inspire confidence in others. He graduated in 1904, ranking in the middle of his class, but already showing hints of the leadership that would later define him. His early service aboard destroyers in the Atlantic revealed an officer unafraid to question tradition. While others followed orders to the letter, Halsey asked why rules existed at all. This habit, unusual at the time, would later help him reshape the way the Navy fought. During the First World War, he commanded destroyers protecting convoys in the submarine-infested Atlantic. There, he learned the value of offense over passive defense and the advantage of speed and surprise over sheer numbers. When German U-boats threatened, Halsey did not merely respond, he hunted. The conflict ended before he could test his ideas fully, but it left him convinced that hesitation was deadly and that once initiative was lost, it was almost impossible to regain. These lessons from the gray Atlantic would echo decades later across the wide Pacific. By the 1920s, he was already marked as a promising officer, known for bold instincts and natural leadership, yet also for pushing limits. He inspired fierce loyalty among subordinates, while making some of his superiors uneasy. Exactly such a commander would be needed when America eventually faced the challenge of Imperial Japan. The transformation of William Halsey from surface warfare specialist to aviation pioneer began in 1934, when he was 52 years old. Most officers his age were content to coast toward retirement, but Halsey made a decision that would change not only his career, but the future of naval warfare. He enrolled in flight training at Pensacola Naval Air Station. At an age when most men avoid new challenges, Halsey threw himself into learning the intricacies of aircraft carrier operations. He did not merely study aviation, he immersed himself in its possibilities. While traditionalists still viewed carriers as support vessels for the mighty battleships, Halsey recognized the revolutionary potential of naval aviation. His conversion was both intellectual and emotional. Intellectually, he grasped how aircraft could extend the reach of naval power beyond the horizon. A battleship could strike targets 20 miles away. Carrier aircraft could reach targets 200 miles distant. But emotionally, Halsey was drawn to the aggressive possibilities that aviation offered. The ability to strike first, strike hard, and strike deep into enemy territory. Command of the carrier Saratoga in the late 1930s gave Halsey his laboratory. He experimented with new tactical formations, pushed his pilots to extend their operational envelope, and developed the Fast Carrier Task Force concept that would prove crucial in the coming war. His innovations were not always welcomed by the naval establishment, but Halsey pressed forward with the conviction that the next war would be won by those bold enough to embrace new methods. During fleet exercises in the late 1930s, Halsey's carrier forces repeatedly achieved results that shocked traditional naval thinkers. His ships could appear suddenly at unexpected points, deliver devastating attacks, and vanish before enemy forces could respond. This was warfare at the speed of flight, and Halsey was its most aggressive practitioner. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor would prove Halsey's theories correct in the most dramatic way possible. The age of the battleship was ending, and the age of the aircraft carrier was beginning. Halsey had positioned himself at the forefront of this revolution, and when war came, he would be ready to unleash the full fury of American naval aviation upon an empire that had awakened a sleeping giant. December 7, 1941, found Admiral Halsey at sea, his flagship Enterprise returning from delivering Marine fighters to Wake Island. As the carrier approached Pearl Harbor, radio messages began filtering through the static, confused reports of an attack, then clearer signals that left no doubt about what had happened. The Japanese had struck the first blow, and the United States Navy lay crippled at its most important Pacific base. Halsey's first glimpse of Pearl Harbor burned itself into his memory. The great battleships Arizona and Oklahoma were gone, their crews entombed in twisted steel. The harbor reeked of fuel oil and death, while rescue crews worked frantically to pull survivors from the wreckage. For most Americans, December 7th represented a day of infamy and defeat. For Halsey, it was a call to arms. Within hours of learning about the attack, Halsey issued orders that would define American naval strategy for the next 4 years. When his operations officer protested about starting a private war, Halsey gave the legendary response: "Sink any shipping sighted, shoot down any plane encountered." This was not merely anger speaking, it was strategic clarity. The time for defensive thinking had ended. The first American offensive operations of World War II bore Halsey's signature: swift, audacious carrier raids against Japanese-held islands. In February 1942, his task force struck the Marshall Islands, proving that American carriers could operate deep in Japanese-controlled waters. The raids achieved limited military damage but enormous psychological impact, proving to Americans that their Navy could fight back. More significantly, these early operations validated Halsey's pre-war innovations in carrier warfare. His fast-moving task forces could appear suddenly, deliver concentrated attacks, and withdraw before Japanese forces could respond. This hit-and-run strategy frustrated Japanese commanders, who were accustomed to the more predictable movements of traditional naval forces. The most famous of these early raids came in April 1942, when Halsey's Enterprise joined the carrier Hornet in launching the Doolittle raid against Japan itself. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's B-25 bombers, launching from Hornet's deck 600 miles from Japan, struck Tokyo and other cities before flying on to crash land in China. The physical damage was minimal, but the psychological impact was enormous. Japan's home islands were no longer safe. For Halsey, the Doolittle raid represented vindication of everything he believed about naval aviation. Traditional naval thinking would have considered the operation impossible, launching Army bombers from a Navy carrier to attack an enemy homeland while operating deep in hostile waters. But Halsey thrived on the impossible, and his willingness to embrace radical concepts would soon transform him from an aggressive admiral into a national hero. The American public, desperate for good news after months of defeats, embraced Halsey as the embodiment of fighting spirit. Newspapers called him Bull Halsey, capturing both his aggressive nature and his ability to charge straight at any enemy. But those who knew him understood that beneath the bull-like exterior lay a sharp, tactical mind capable of the kind of innovative thinking that would prove essential in the years ahead. August 1942 found American forces clinging to a small airfield on an obscure island in the Solomon Chain. Guadalcanal had become the focal point of a brutal campaign that would determine whether Japan could be stopped in its drive toward Australia. For 6 months, American Marines and soldiers fought a desperate battle against Japanese forces determined to reclaim the island at any cost. Into this cauldron came Admiral Halsey, replacing the exhausted Admiral Robert Gormley as commander of South Pacific forces. Halsey arrived to find American morale at its lowest point of the war. Naval forces were stretched thin, ground troops were barely holding their positions, and many officers doubted whether Guadalcanal could be held at all. The Japanese controlled the seas around the island during daylight hours, running supply convoys down what Americans grimly called the slot every night. Halsey's impact was immediate and electric. Within days of his arrival, the entire atmosphere of the South Pacific Command changed. Where Gormley had been cautious and defensive, Halsey was aggressive and offensive. He issued new orders that reflected his fundamental philosophy. When faced with a choice between attack and defense, always attack. The South Pacific Command needed a fighter, and the hard-driving William Halsey proved to be exactly the right admiral for the job. He reorganized his forces to maximize their offensive potential, concentrated his limited resources for maximum impact, and most importantly, convinced his subordinates that they could not only hold Guadalcanal, but drive the Japanese from the entire Solomon Chain. The naval battle of Guadalcanal in mid-November 1942 became Halsey's first major test as a theater commander. Japanese forces launched their most determined effort to retake the island, sending battleships and cruisers in a massive night attack designed to destroy Henderson Field and its precious aircraft. American naval forces were outnumbered and outgunned, but Halsey had taught them something the Japanese had not anticipated: the willingness to fight against overwhelming odds. The 3-day battle that followed was among the most vicious naval encounters of the entire war. American ships, following Halsey's aggressive doctrine, charged straight into superior Japanese forces rather than conducting the careful, defensive battle their numbers seemed to dictate. The light cruiser Atlanta and both admirals commanding American forces were lost, but the Japanese paid an even heavier price, losing 2 battleships and several other major warships. More importantly, the Japanese never again attempted to retake Guadalcanal with major naval forces. Halsey's willingness to accept heavy casualties in exchange for tactical victory had broken the back of Japanese expansion in the South Pacific. The island that had seemed impossible to hold became the foundation for American offensive operations throughout the Solomon Islands. Halsey's success at Guadalcanal established his reputation as the most aggressive commander in the Pacific theater. His methods were sometimes costly. American casualties were heavy, and his willingness to risk major warships in night battles horrified some of his superiors. But results spoke louder than casualties, and by early 1943, Japanese forces were in full retreat throughout the Solomon Chain. The victory at Guadalcanal also revealed both Halsey's greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. His strength lay in his ability to inspire subordinates to fight beyond their apparent capabilities, to convince them that victory was possible even in seemingly hopeless situations. His weakness was his tendency to view every tactical situation through the lens of aggressive offense. sometimes failing to consider whether the potential gains justified the inevitable losses. By 1943, the strategic initiative in the Pacific had shifted decisively to the Americans, and Admiral Halsey found himself at the center of the most ambitious naval offensive in history. The Gilbert and Marshall Islands fell to American amphibious assaults, while Halsey's fast carrier task forces roamed the Central Pacific, striking Japanese positions with impunity. The transformation of American naval power during this period reflected many of Halsey's pre-war innovations finally coming to fruition. The Fast Carrier Task Force, built around groups of Essex-class carriers protected by new battleships and cruisers, could project devastating air power across thousands of miles of ocean. These task forces moved at the speed of their fastest ships, struck without warning, and vanished before enemy forces could respond. Halsey's tactical innovations during this period revolutionized naval warfare. He perfected the art of coordinated air attacks, with multiple carrier groups converging on a single target from different directions. His pilots learned to strike in waves, with each group exploiting the confusion created by the previous attack. The result was a level of concentrated air power that Japanese defenders found impossible to counter. The destruction of Japanese naval aviation at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 represented the culmination of Halsey's carrier warfare theories. American pilots, trained in the aggressive tactics he had pioneered, shot down over 400 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 30 of their own. The engagement became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, reflecting the one-sided nature of the combat. Yet even in victory, Halsey's aggressive instincts sometimes created problems for American planners. His tendency to pursue every tactical advantage to its logical conclusion meant that his operations often exceeded their original scope, requiring additional resources and extending operational timelines. While these extended operations usually achieved greater results than originally planned, they also strained American logistics and complicated strategic coordination. The capture of the Mariana Islands in summer 1944 gave American forces bases from which B-29 superfortresses could reach the Japanese home islands. For Halsey, this represented vindication of his belief that aggressive naval operations could directly contribute to strategic victory. His carrier forces had not merely supported the amphibious landings, they had created the conditions that made strategic bombing of Japan possible. As American forces prepared for the invasion of the Philippines in late 1944, Halsey commanded the most powerful naval force in history. Task Force 38 included 7 Essex-class carriers, 6 light carriers, 8 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. This massive concentration of firepower could deliver more destructive force than entire armies had possessed just a few years earlier. But with great power came great responsibility, and the decisions Halsey would make in the coming months would test not only his tactical skills, but his strategic judgment. The invasion of the Philippines would present him with opportunities for decisive victory, but also with temptations that would nearly lead to catastrophic defeat. October 1944 brought the largest naval battle in history to the waters around the Philippine Islands. Operation King II, the American invasion of Leyte, represented the beginning of the final assault on the Japanese Empire. For Admiral Halsey, commanding the powerful Task Force 38, it promised to be the climactic engagement he had been preparing for since Pearl Harbor. The Japanese response to the Leyte landings was desperate and complex. Unable to match American naval strength in direct combat, Japanese planners devised an elaborate deception plan designed to lure Halsey's carriers away from the invasion beaches. A decoy force of carriers with few aircraft would approach from the north, while the main Japanese battle fleet would strike the invasion forces from the west. On October 24th, as American reconnaissance planes reported the approach of the Japanese decoy force, Halsey faced the most crucial decision of his career. The Japanese carriers represented exactly the kind of target he had been seeking, the remnants of the once mighty combined fleet, apparently vulnerable to decisive attack. Every instinct honed over 3 years of combat told him to pursue and destroy these ships. Admiral Nimitz had given Halsey carte blanche to engage the Japanese Navy, even at the cost of protecting the Leyte invasion forces. This freedom of action, intended to maximize Halsey's tactical flexibility, now created a strategic dilemma. Should he remain near Leyte to protect the invasion forces, or should he pursue the Japanese carriers and attempt to end their threat once and for all? Halsey chose the aggressive option, ordering his entire force northward in pursuit of the Japanese decoy fleet. This decision reflected everything he believed about naval warfare, that offensive action was always preferable to defensive posture, that decisive battles should be sought rather than avoided, that the destruction of enemy naval forces was more important than the protection of friendly forces. The battle off Cape Engano on October 25th saw Halsey achieve exactly what he had hoped for: the complete destruction of the Japanese decoy force. American aircraft sank 4 carriers and damaged every other ship in the enemy formation. As a tactical engagement, it represented a perfect execution of the fast carrier warfare concepts Halsey had pioneered. But while Halsey was destroying Japanese carriers in the north, disaster was unfolding in the south. The main Japanese battle fleet, led by the massive battleship Yamato, had penetrated Leyte Gulf and was attacking the invasion forces Halsey was supposed to protect. Only the desperate courage of American escort carriers and destroyers prevented a complete catastrophe, but the cost was heavy. Several ships lost and hundreds of American sailors killed. The most dramatic moment came when Admiral Nimitz, monitoring the battle from Pearl Harbor, sent Halsey a message that would haunt the admiral for the rest of his life. "Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders." The communication, intended as a simple request for information, became a public symbol of Halsey's absence from the crucial point of battle. Halsey's response to this criticism revealed both his strength and his weakness as a commander. He immediately turned south with his fast battleships, hoping to catch the retreating Japanese forces, but arrived too late to affect the outcome. His tactical victory in the north had been complete, but his strategic absence from the south had nearly led to disaster. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended in overwhelming American victory. The Japanese combined fleet was effectively destroyed as an offensive force. But the price of this victory raised uncomfortable questions about Halsey's judgment. Had his pursuit of the decoy force been brilliant strategy or dangerous negligence? The debate would continue long after the war ended, with historians and naval officers arguing both sides with equal conviction. For Halsey himself, Leyte Gulf represented both vindication and humiliation. He had achieved the decisive victory he had always sought, but at the cost of nearly allowing the very forces he was supposed to protect to be destroyed. It was a lesson in the complexity of high command, where even correct decisions could have unintended consequences, and where tactical brilliance did not always translate into strategic wisdom. 2 months after Leyte Gulf, Admiral Halsey faced an enemy more dangerous than any Japanese fleet: the fury of nature itself. December 17, 1944, found Task Force 38 conducting routine refueling operations 300 miles east of the Philippines, when weather reports began indicating the approach of a tropical storm. The storm that became known as Typhoon Cobra sank 3 destroyers, killed 790 sailors, damaged 9 other warships, and swept dozens of aircraft overboard off their aircraft carriers. The destroyers Hull, Spence, and Monaghan were lost with 775 of their crewmen, while only 91 men were rescued from the sea. Halsey's decisions in the hours before Typhoon Cobra struck revealed both his strengths and his most dangerous weakness. His strength lay in his determination to maintain offensive operations regardless of external circumstances. He was reluctant to disperse his task force because doing so would interrupt planned airstrikes against Japanese positions. His weakness was his tendency to believe that aggressive action could overcome any obstacle, even the laws of physics. Although he was aware of the storm in his vicinity, Admiral Halsey thought the storm would pass to his east and ordered his fleet to maintain course. This decision reflected his lifelong pattern of choosing offense over defense, but meteorology operates according to different rules than naval combat. The storm did not retreat when challenged. Instead, it engulfed the American task force with winds exceeding 150 miles per hour and waves reaching 90 feet in height. The 3 destroyers that were lost, Hull, Spence, and Monaghan, were older ships with high centers of gravity, making them particularly vulnerable to capsizing in extreme weather. As the typhoon intensified, these vessels found themselves fighting for survival against forces no human technology could master. One by one, they rolled over and disappeared beneath mountainous waves, taking most of their crews with them. Task Force 38, under Halsey's command, included 7 Essex-class carriers, 6 light carriers, 8 battleships, 4 heavy and 11 light cruisers, along with approximately 50 destroyers. Even the largest ships in this massive force were battered by the storm. Flight decks were damaged, aircraft were swept overboard, and the carrier Monterey suffered serious fires that killed 3 crewmen and destroyed 18 aircraft. 146 aircraft were destroyed or lost overboard, and 790 sailors perished. Despite fleet-wide rescue efforts, only 94 men were pulled alive from the sea. The rescue operations that followed the typhoon revealed both the heroism of American sailors and the limitations of even the most advanced naval forces when confronted by nature's fury. The court of inquiry that investigated Typhoon Cobra found Halsey guilty of errors in judgment, but stopped short of serious disciplinary action. The investigation concluded that better weather forecasting might have prevented the disaster, but also acknowledged that Halsey's primary responsibility was combat operations against Japanese forces, not weather avoidance. The promotion Halsey received shortly after remained controversial, considering that between Leyte and the typhoon, Halsey was responsible for the loss of 7 warships and 1,450 men without accountability. This contrast with the treatment of other commanders, such as General Patton, who had been sidelined for much less serious infractions, raised questions about standards of accountability for senior officers. For Halsey, Typhoon Cobra represented a harsh lesson in the limits of aggressive leadership. Throughout his career, he had succeeded by refusing to accept defeat, by pushing forward when other commanders might have retreated. But the laws of physics and meteorology do not yield to human determination, and his failure to recognize this fundamental truth had cost the lives of hundreds of his sailors. The typhoon also revealed something troubling about Halsey's command philosophy. His instinctive response to any challenge was to attack it directly, but some problems cannot be solved through aggressive action. Sometimes, the wisest course is strategic withdrawal, and Halsey's inability to recognize such situations would continue to create problems throughout the remainder of his career. Despite the controversies surrounding his decisions at Leyte Gulf and during Typhoon Cobra, Admiral Halsey remained in command of the Third Fleet as American forces prepared for the final assault on Japan. The last months of the war would see him leading the most devastating naval air campaign in history, while also participating in the ceremonies that would finally bring the Pacific War to an end. The strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands during 1945 showcased the full maturation of the carrier warfare concepts Halsey had pioneered. Task Force 38, operating in the waters around Japan, launched massive airstrikes against industrial targets, airfields, and naval installations. These attacks, coordinated with B-29 raids from the Marianas, systematically destroyed Japan's remaining capacity for organized resistance. Halsey's approach to these final operations reflected both his accumulated experience and his unchanged fundamental philosophy. He continued to favor concentrated attacks over dispersed operations, preferring to overwhelm specific targets rather than spreading his forces across multiple objectives. This approach proved devastatingly effective against a Japanese defense that was increasingly desperate and disorganized. The sinking of the battleship Yamato in April 1945 represented the final vindication of Halsey's pre-war theories about naval aviation. The massive battleship, pride of the Japanese Navy and symbol of traditional naval power, was sunk by aircraft from Halsey's carriers without ever coming within gun range of an American surface ship. The age of the battleship was definitively over, and the age of the aircraft carrier had fully arrived. As Japan's position became increasingly hopeless during the summer of 1945, Halsey's forces ranged freely along the Japanese coast, striking targets that had been immune from attack just months earlier. The psychological impact of these raids was enormous. Japanese civilians could see American aircraft overhead, proof that their government's promises of ultimate victory were hollow. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought a sudden end to the war. But Halsey's task force remained on station, ready to support the planned invasion of Japan if necessary. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15th, Halsey's sailors found themselves preparing not for battle, but for the complex process of accepting the enemy's capitulation. For the 2 weeks before the official surrender, Admiral Halsey had a new boss, the newly named Supreme Commander General Douglas MacArthur. This arrangement reflected the political complexity of ending the war, but also created potential friction between two commanders with very different approaches to leadership and publicity. The formal surrender ceremony aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, represented the culmination of everything Halsey had worked toward since Pearl Harbor. As he watched Japanese officials sign the surrender documents, he could reflect on a war that had transformed him from an aggressive but relatively obscure admiral into one of the most famous military commanders in American history. The Missouri itself was symbolic of the changes the war had brought to naval warfare. Though technically still the flagship of the fleet, the battleship's primary role during the ceremony was ceremonial. Real naval power now resided in the aircraft carriers that surrounded Tokyo Bay, the same type of ships that Halsey had championed when most naval officers still believed in the supremacy of the battleship's guns. For Halsey personally, the surrender ceremony represented both vindication and anticlimax. His theories about naval aviation had been proven correct. His aggressive leadership had contributed decisively to American victory, and his name had become synonymous with fighting spirit throughout the American public. Yet victory also meant the end of the kind of warfare at which he excelled, raising questions about what role he would play in the peacetime Navy. The transition from wartime hero to peacetime administrator proved more difficult for William Halsey than the transition from surface warfare to naval aviation had been decades earlier. Victory in the Pacific had made him one of the most famous military officers in America, but it had also left him with few obvious roles in a Navy that was rapidly contracting from its wartime size. Halsey's immediate post-war assignments reflected both his status as a national hero and the Navy's uncertainty about how to employ his particular talents. He was promoted to Fleet Admiral, the Navy's highest rank, and given command of the Third Fleet during the initial occupation of Japan. However, these positions were largely ceremonial, lacking the operational challenges that had defined his wartime service. The peacetime Navy's emphasis on administration and diplomacy suited Halsey poorly. Throughout his career, he had excelled at the tactical and operational levels of command, where quick decisions and aggressive action produced immediate results. The slower pace of peacetime military affairs, with their emphasis on long-term planning and political considerations, frustrated his action-oriented temperament. Halsey's relationship with the press during this period revealed both his continued popularity with the American public and his discomfort with his new role. Journalists continued to seek him out for interviews and opinions on current events, but his responses often reflected the impatience of a warrior trying to adapt to peacetime constraints. His comments sometimes created diplomatic complications that more politically astute officers managed to avoid. The reduction of the Navy to its peacetime size created particular challenges for an officer of Halsey's seniority and reputation. Many of the ships he had commanded during the war were being decommissioned. Many of the officers who had served under him were returning to civilian life, and the sense of urgent purpose that had defined the war years was rapidly dissipating. Halsey's final active duty assignment was as commander of the 8th Fleet, a position that carried significant prestige but limited operational responsibilities. The Cold War was beginning to develop, but American naval strategy during this period focused primarily on maintaining technological superiority rather than conducting active operations. This strategic approach, while sensible from a national perspective, provided few opportunities for the kind of aggressive leadership at which Halsey excelled. His retirement from active duty in 1947 marked the end of one of the most distinguished careers in American naval history. The ceremony took place aboard his flagship, with many of the officers who had served under him during the war in attendance. But the event also highlighted how much the Navy had changed since Pearl Harbor. Many of the ships and aircraft that had been revolutionary during the war were already obsolete, replaced by new technologies that reflected the lessons learned during the Pacific Campaign. Halsey's transition to civilian life was smoother than his adaptation to peacetime military service had been. He accepted positions on various corporate boards, leveraging his fame and leadership experience in the business world. However, his heart remained with the Navy, and he continued to follow developments in naval technology and strategy with the interest of a professional rather than the detachment of a retiree. The publication of his memoirs in 1947 provided Halsey with an opportunity to reflect on his career and address some of the controversies that had surrounded his wartime decisions. His account of events was characteristically direct and unapologetic, defending his aggressive approach while acknowledging that some of his decisions had been costly. The passage of time did little to resolve the fundamental debates surrounding William Halsey's legacy as a naval commander. If anything, the perspective provided by peace only intensified the arguments between his admirers and his critics, with each side marshaling evidence to support their interpretation of his career. His supporters emphasized his role in transforming American naval strategy from defensive to offensive, pointing to his early carrier raids as proof of his tactical innovation and strategic vision. They argued that his aggressive leadership had been exactly what American forces needed during the dark days after Pearl Harbor, when defeat seemed possible and victory required commanders willing to take extraordinary risks. The transformation of the United States Navy from a traditional battleship-centered force to the world's premier carrier navy owed much to Halsey's pioneering work in the 1930s and early 1940s. His willingness to experiment with new formations and tactics, often in defiance of established doctrine, had provided the foundation for American dominance in the Pacific theater. His critics focused on his decision-making during the Battle of Leyte Gulf and his responsibility for the losses during Typhoon Cobra, arguing that his aggressive instincts sometimes overwhelmed his strategic judgment. They pointed out that effective command required not only the ability to take calculated risks, but also the wisdom to recognize when aggressive action might be counterproductive. The casualties associated with Halsey's commands, both in combat and in natural disasters, raised uncomfortable questions about the acceptable cost of aggressive leadership. While his supporters argued that bold action had ultimately saved more lives than it cost by shortening the war, his critics maintained that more careful planning might have achieved similar results with fewer losses. Interviews with officers who had served under Halsey revealed the complexity of his command style. Many described him as inspiring and decisive, a leader who could make difficult decisions quickly and communicate them clearly to subordinates. However, others noted his impatience with detailed planning and his tendency to dismiss concerns that did not align with his operational preferences. The enlisted men who had served in his fleet were almost universally positive in their recollections of Halsey. They remembered him as a commander who understood their concerns, who visited ships regularly to talk with ordinary sailors, and who never asked them to take risks he was not willing to share. This connection with the men under his command had been one of his greatest strengths as a leader. Stories of Halsey's personal courage became part of his legend, though some were certainly embellished in the retelling. Sailors spoke of him remaining on the bridge during air attacks, of his refusal to take shelter during typhoons, and of his habit of appearing wherever the action was heaviest. Whether literally true or not, these stories reflected the respect his men had for his willingness to share their dangers. His relationship with other senior commanders remained complex even in retirement. Some, like Admiral Chester Nimitz, publicly praised his contributions to victory while privately expressing reservations about his judgment. Others, particularly those who had served in the Atlantic or European theaters, viewed him as a glory-seeking admiral who had been fortunate to serve in a theater where his aggressive instincts aligned with strategic requirements. The evolution of naval technology during the Cold War seemed to vindicate many of Halsey's theories about the future of warfare. The development of nuclear-powered carriers, jet aircraft, and guided missiles represented extensions of concepts he had pioneered decades earlier. His emphasis on mobility, concentration of force, and aggressive employment of naval aviation had become fundamental principles of modern naval warfare. The influence of William Halsey's career extended far beyond his individual achievements, shaping American naval doctrine and military culture in ways that continued to resonate decades after his retirement. His transformation from battleship traditionalist to carrier aviation pioneer provided a model for the kind of intellectual flexibility that modern military officers would need to master rapidly evolving technologies. The Fast Carrier Task Force concept that Halsey pioneered during the 1930s became the foundation of American naval power projection throughout the Cold War. The ability to deploy concentrated air power anywhere in the world's oceans, striking targets hundreds of miles inland while remaining mobile enough to avoid retaliation, revolutionized both naval warfare and international diplomacy. Modern carrier battle groups, with their emphasis on integrated air defense and power projection, directly descended from the tactical formations Halsey developed during World War II. The coordination between different types of ships, the use of aircraft for both offensive and defensive purposes, and the emphasis on maintaining tactical flexibility while pursuing strategic objectives all reflected lessons learned during his wartime commands. Naval officers studying at the War College continued to analyze Halsey's campaigns long after the war ended, using his successes and failures as case studies in operational leadership. His decision-making process at Leyte Gulf became a standard example of how tactical brilliance could create strategic complications, while his early carrier raids demonstrated the psychological impact that aggressive action could have on both friendly and enemy forces. The development of nuclear weapons added new dimensions to the strategic concepts Halsey had pioneered. Carrier-based nuclear-capable aircraft extended the reach of American military power in ways that even Halsey might not have envisioned. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Naval aviation could project decisive force across vast distances, making traditional concepts of geographic security obsolete. Hollywood's portrayal of Halsey in films and documentaries helped cement his reputation in popular culture, though these depictions often simplified the complexity of his character and commands. The image of Bull Halsey as the quintessential fighting admiral became part of American mythology, inspiring subsequent generations of naval officers, while sometimes obscuring the more nuanced aspects of his leadership. His influence on naval education was equally significant. The Naval Academy began emphasizing the kind of innovative thinking that Halsey had demonstrated throughout his career, encouraging midshipmen to question established doctrine while mastering fundamental principles. This balance between tradition and innovation became a hallmark of American naval education. The emergence of naval aviation as the dominant form of sea power vindicated Halsey's early conversion from surface warfare to carrier operations. By the 1960s, battleships had disappeared from the active fleet, while aircraft carriers had become the centerpieces of American naval strategy. This transformation represented the complete victory of the concepts Halsey had championed against considerable opposition from naval traditionalists. International naval forces also adopted many of Halsey's innovations, particularly his emphasis on coordinated air operations and mobile task force formations. The Royal Navy, which had pioneered carrier aviation during World War I, incorporated American tactical developments into their own doctrine, while emerging naval powers studied American carrier operations as models for their own force development. The strategic bombing campaigns that followed World War II, from Korea through Vietnam and beyond, reflected many of the principles Halsey had established for naval air operations. The emphasis on concentrated attacks, the coordination of different types of aircraft for maximum effect, and the use of air power to achieve psychological as well as physical objectives all showed his influence on American military thinking. Behind the official records and formal histories of Admiral Halsey's career lay a treasure trove of personal anecdotes and lesser-known incidents that revealed the human side of one of America's most famous military commanders. These stories, passed down through generations of naval officers and enlisted men, painted a picture of a leader who was both larger than life and remarkably approachable. One tale that circulated among the crew of the Enterprise involved Halsey's reaction to a young sailor who had accidentally damaged expensive radio equipment during a rough storm. While most admirals would have delegated such disciplinary matters to subordinates, Halsey personally visited the sailor's duty station to assess the situation. After examining the damage, he reportedly told the young man that anyone who could break equipment that badly during a storm was exactly the kind of aggressive fighter the Navy needed. His relationship with his staff officers was marked by an informality that was unusual for senior commanders of his era. Unlike many admirals who maintained rigid social distances, Halsey encouraged his subordinates to speak freely during planning sessions, even when their opinions contradicted his own preferences. This openness sometimes led to heated discussions, but it also ensured that alternative viewpoints received consideration before major decisions were made. The admiral's personal habits became legendary among those who served with him. He was known for his early morning walks around the flight deck of whatever ship served as his flagship, using these solitary moments to think through tactical problems while observing the daily routines of his sailors. These walks, regardless of weather conditions, became such a fixture that crew members could set their watches by his appearance. During the darkest days of the Guadalcanal campaign, when American forces were barely holding their positions against determined Japanese attacks, Halsey made an unscheduled visit to the island that nearly resulted in disaster. His transport aircraft came under attack by Japanese fighters, and only the intervention of American P-38s prevented the admiral from becoming a casualty. His staff later learned that he had insisted on making the trip despite intelligence reports, indicating heavy enemy air activity in the area. The incident that perhaps best illustrated Halsey's character involved his response to a junior officer who had questioned one of his tactical decisions during a planning conference. Rather than taking offense at the challenge to his authority, Halsey spent several hours with the officer, working through the tactical problem from multiple angles. When they finished, the admiral publicly acknowledged that the younger man's analysis had identified a significant flaw in the original plan. His correspondence with family members during the war revealed a side of his personality that rarely appeared in official communications. Letters to his wife Frances showed genuine concern for the welfare of his sailors, worry about the strategic implications of his decisions, and occasional doubts about whether his aggressive approach was always appropriate. These private moments of reflection contrasted sharply with his public image of unwavering confidence. The admiral's relationship with war correspondents was complex and sometimes stormy. He understood the importance of maintaining public morale through positive press coverage, but he also fiercely protected operational security and refused to allow journalists to publish information that might endanger his forces. Several reporters found themselves temporarily banned from his ships after publishing stories that revealed too much about American capabilities or intentions. One of the most revealing incidents occurred during the final months of the war, when a young ensign approached Halsey with a suggestion for improving aircraft recovery procedures. The ensign, fresh from flight training and nervous about addressing such a senior officer, was surprised when Halsey not only listened to his idea, but immediately ordered trials to test its effectiveness. The procedure proved successful and was adopted throughout the task force, demonstrating the admiral's willingness to learn from subordinates regardless of their rank or experience. His famous temper, which had earned him the nickname Bull, was usually directed at incompetence or lack of effort rather than honest mistakes. Officers who had served under him recalled that he could be scathing in his criticism of poor performance, but he was equally generous in his praise for those who demonstrated initiative and courage. This combination of high standards and fair treatment earned him the fierce loyalty of most of his subordinates. The physical courage that Halsey displayed throughout his career was matched by a moral courage that sometimes put him at odds with his superiors. When he believed that a particular order or policy was wrong, he was not hesitant to express his disagreement, even when doing so might harm his career prospects. This willingness to speak truth to power, while sometimes creating difficulties, also ensured that important dissenting views received consideration at the highest levels of command. Perhaps the most telling story about Halsey's character involved his reaction to learning about the casualties his task force had suffered during Typhoon Cobra. According to witnesses, the normally stoic admiral was visibly shaken by the reports of ships lost and sailors killed. He spent hours reviewing weather reports and operational logs, trying to understand what he might have done differently to prevent the disaster. This personal anguish, hidden from public view, revealed the heavy burden that command responsibility placed on even the most confident leaders. His retirement years were marked by a genuine humility about his place in naval history. When younger officers sought his advice about command decisions, he often emphasized the importance of learning from failure as well as success. He freely admitted his mistakes, particularly his decision-making during Typhoon Cobra, and used these examples to illustrate the complexity of high-level command. The final chapter of Halsey's life demonstrated the same courage he had shown throughout his career. When diagnosed with heart disease, he approached his illness with the same direct, no-nonsense attitude he had brought to naval combat. He continued to fulfill his public obligations until his health no longer permitted, refusing to let physical limitations diminish his service to the Navy he had served for over 40 years. William Frederick Halsey, Jr. died on August 20, 1959, at the age of 76. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery drew thousands of mourners, including many of the sailors who had served under his command during the war. The ceremony was both a tribute to his individual achievements and a recognition of his role in transforming the United States Navy into the world's premier naval force. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Halsey's legacy was not found in the formal ceremonies or official eulogies. It was found in the aircraft carriers that continued to patrol the world's oceans, in the naval aviation tactics that bore his influence, and in the generations of naval officers who had learned from his example that sometimes the greatest victories required the courage to risk everything in pursuit of an uncertain outcome. The storm that had been William Halsey's life had finally passed, but the impact of his passage would continue to shape American naval power for decades to come. He had been a man who rode the storm rather than sheltering from it, and in doing so he had helped determine the outcome of the greatest naval war in history.